Okay, Kalimera. I'm delighted to be here with Robert Kaplan, who's a famous professor of geopolitics from the States, now with the Foreign Policy Research Institute, to talk about the wider Middle East. And he is author of many books, but most recently, The Loom of Time, Between Empire and Anarchy, from the Mediterranean to China. So it covers a vast sweep. It's got deep historical roots, but obviously we're going to try and bring some of the lessons from that book to today. And just so you know who I am, I'm Hugo Dixon. I'm the commentator at large at Reuters. So Robert, can we start off by, could you perhaps sort of set out what is the key theme from your book and how it relates in broad brush terms to the issues that we're facing in the Middle East today?
Yes, the key theme is that while the media concentrates on democracy versus dictatorship, and I'm talking about a region from essentially North Africa all the way to the borders of China, even into China when you include Western China, which is East Turkestan.
Right.
You know, so we're really talking about, and even but even a place like some of the Balkan countries, which are Eastern Orthodox, which have a more historically good relationship with Islam compared to Catholicism, kind of. But the main theme is that while the media talks about dictatorship versus democracy, there's a deeper resonance, a deeper theme running through the region, which is the division between empire and anarchy. And by empire, I don't just mean the European empires of the British and French between World War I and World War II, or the French in late 19th century Egypt and Lebanon. I'm talking about going all the way back to late antiquity, when the Middle East was governed by the Umayyad Empire based in Damascus, which stretched all the way from North Africa to what is now Pakistan, what is now Iran, the Abbasid Empire, the Hafsids, the Fatimids, and others. For much of history, the Middle East was governed by a capital that was far, far away from the people in an imperial mode. And that inhibited the development of states. And with inhibiting the development of states, of course, makes democracy in our time more difficult and challenging. Now, there are great variations in this. You know, Tunisia and Egypt had strong state identities compared to the Levant and others. So there's tyranny, empire on one hand, and on the other hand, when you really...
But just to be clear, it's not just ordinary tyranny, it's empire tyranny.
It's empire.
Because it's not tyranny, local tyranny, it's often these thousands of miles span.
And the local tyranny, the other extreme, when you really scratch the surface, comes from this absolute fear of anarchy. That there will be no government if I don't rule the place, essentially. It will just all collapse into anarchy. So you have two extremes, imperial tyranny on one hand, anarchy on the other, and the struggle in each Middle Eastern country, or many of them, is to come to some happy medium, to some moderating medium, which may be democratic, may not be, but some medium, and that is the ongoing struggle. And you find that when you talk to leaders and opposition figures, whether in Egypt or Saudi Arabia, or any place else almost. Turkey and Iran are different.
Okay, maybe we could talk about a couple of these countries in a little bit more depth, and then we will end up talking a bit about the Israel-Palestine issue. But maybe we could start with Egypt, which is, you know, the most populous Arab country in the world. Obviously it's not a democracy at the moment, and there was this brief moment in the Arab Spring where people hoped it would be, but it was sort of over in a blink of an eye. How do you see Egypt navigating this tension between empire and and anarchy? Have they basically decided to go for autocracy? And do you think, is that
Right.
as far as we can see into the future?
Yeah, Egypt basically has a dead-end regime. It's what I call an environmentally driven hard regime. It has no answers to the problem that there's not enough water, not enough farmland, not enough other things. The army completely controls the economy. And when you have a top-down vertical layer of bureaucracy, i.e. the Egyptian military, controlling the economy, there's not much room for true reform. In other words, in the 21st century, economies have to be nimble, horizontal, flat, encourage innovation, all of those things. The Egyptian, the real root, or one of the roots of the problem in Egypt is that the regime, is that the military has too much influence in the economy, and that's what really stifles innovation and development, combined with the fact that that Egypt has, is just enraged over this security problem with Ethiopia, which doesn't get written about much. This is the Ethiopian Grand Renaissance Dam in Western Ethiopia that I'm talking about, where for the first time in history, going back to antiquity, Ethiopia has control of the Nile waters, not Egypt, so to speak. And this is what terrifies the Egyptian regime, in addition to so many other things, so to speak.
So how does this play out then? I mean, this is an extraordinary word you use, a dead-end regime, but how does it end?
Actually, my book has an optimistic layer. And the optimistic layer is just because the Arab Spring and democracy failed once in 2011, and in Egypt between 2011 and 2013, does not mean that it will fail a second or third time. There's progress, though it goes like the loom of time. It's indirect, and it doesn't always occur according to a Western script. And let me give you an example of that. You could have differences of opinions emerge, structural differences of opinion emerge within the Egyptian military. And that could lead to different orientations, which would provide an opening for more freedom. That we should not give up on these countries simply because 2011, the Arab Spring came, it failed, there's no hope, they'll always be autocratic. That's not what history is about, So all I'm saying is we should not expect progress according to a Western script. It can happen. It can happen gradually in circles. You try again, and there. A great Egyptian human rights advocate, Said Ibrahim, told me. He said, Egyptian dictators always start out well, and then it goes bad. The first 10 years are stabilizing, innovative. That was true with Mubarak, though people forget this. And the first 10 years of al-Sisi, he said, were not too bad, given the disorder of the Arab Spring, where you had cuts in electricity, water, violence, all kinds of things. But he said the problems emerge in the second decade, and that's where you can get political upheaval.
Yeah.
So, and now we're deep into the second decade of al-Sisi, and we will see what happens.
Okay, can I switch you now to Saudi Arabia, which is at the other end of the Arab world, and where we've got quite an interesting thing going on. I mean, we've got MBS in charge. Biden saying he wanted to make him her pariah because of the Khashoggi killing. But we've also got quite a lot of things that are happening in terms of modernization, at least, not what we'd call democracy, but certainly types of modernization. There was this clear keenness to do a deal with Israel before October the 7th.
Yeah.
And there still is, it seems, a desire to do something if it can happen, but it was a big if, and we're going to come back to that. But how do you see them navigating this tension between autocracy and anarchy?
Well, you know, one of the people at the conference yesterday who knows Saudi very well, I had a meeting with him, and he said, you know, had it not been for the Istanbul Khashoggi incident, MBS would be the star of the World Conference Circuit now. You know, he would be seen as like the Lee Kuan Yew of the World Conference Circuit because of all the reforms he's instituted.
Right.
I mean, it's someone who knows Saudi Arabia from like 10 or 15 years ago to go there now is astounded. Because women, not only do women drive, but they actually run things. The women in the workforce has increased from 10% to 43%. Over the last 7 years, which is an astounding social change. Because if you liberate half of the workforce, you change the thinking of the other half.
Right.
You liberate women, you change the thinking of men. Now, this is all very uneven because women in poor families are still oppressed. They don't have opportunities. You know, this is mainly for women in the middle, upper level, but it's real progress, and it's more than that. It's something that happens relatively rarely, which is the change in a culture. You know, changing cultures are rare. Ataturk changed Turkish culture. Lee Kuan Yew changed, you know, Malaysian, Singaporean culture. It happens, but it's rare enough so that we remember it. MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, has been changing the Saudi culture. And the question is why? Well, the reason is, as his assistants explained to me, Saudi Arabia knows that there will be an end to the oil and gas age. It's not going to be nearly as fast as people expect, but it will happen. And in order to prepare and position the Saudis for this energy transition, the economy has to become more dynamic, which means Saudis themselves have to become more dynamic. And so one of the things you do is you liberate women on an ongoing basis. Another thing you do, and this was before October 7th, was to have basically a strategic acquisition of Israel. In other words, to get access to their high technology, to their innovative trade and, and economics. So you take care of Israel, you take care of women, you do a whole bunch of other reforms. And so this place can survive even as the need for oil and gas diminishes. That has been their working modus. And the most interesting thing is that if you talk to Saudis about the Arab Spring, what they will say is, look, we saw the Arab Spring in Libya. It led to total collapse. We saw it in Yemen, which had been governed by Ali Abdullah Saleh for over 30 years. It led to collapse. We saw it lead to, to real instability in Egypt. We saw the collapse of Syria, on and on. He said, in Saudi, we have had the same royal family in government for over 100 years. There's been about half a dozen or more changes of government because of the death of the leader, and they've all been replaced within 48 hours by an equally moderate conservative leader who, and in the case of NBS, it was time for a generational change. So they say to me, what's wrong with that? Why should we listen to you Americans promoting democracy in the Arab Spring? Look what happened throughout the region. And in Saudi and also the Gulf states, there's a kind of an informal social contract between the regime and its people. The regime agrees to provide stable, predictable, high technocratic imperial rule, and in return, the people don't question who's in power.
Okay.
And it's not perfect, but
no, it's nothing's perfect, but it's a very interesting take, and I never heard that one before. That we should think of MBS as the new Lee Kuan Yew. And I wanted to bring you, though, cantering over vast territory, which your book does, to Iran. And we are now, what are we? We are 45 years since the revolution. I think that's
Yeah,
right.
it's 45.
45, and obviously Khamenei is looking very long in the tooth. It's quite interesting that it's got its proxies, but it seems not to want to have a war with Israel. We'll see how they react, and they're promising some reaction to what happened in Damascus the other day. But is it time that we start thinking about, not talking about the short term, but as we talk to the medium term, is it time that we start thinking about what a post-Ayatollah regime would look like, or is that premature to start thinking about that? And what does that mean geopolitically as well?
It's absolutely necessary. One of the lessons of Tolstoy's War and Peace is that it's not enough to know something analytically. Mm-hmm. You have to use your imagination to actually imagine it. And we have to use our imagination in looking at Iran. Iran is like a regime of North Koreans who happen to govern a country of South Koreans. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Iranian people, the regime is hated, among a large swath of the Iranian population. And, one thing you have not seen in this crisis since October 7th is you have not seen big, major pro-Palestinian demonstrations in Iran itself. That's because the regime can get a rent-a-crowd for a small demonstration, but the masses are not with the regime on this. The regime it's alienated from the people, it destroyed the middle class, it's hated by the people, and I call it, it's in its Brezhnev phase of its revolutionary state. Leonid Brezhnev being a late, long-term, but very stodgy, uninnovative leader of the Soviet Union a few years before it collapsed. And I think, if you look at,
that means, Brezhnev was still there for quite a bit of time, wasn't he? How many years did he do?
He was in power from 64 to 82.
Okay, well, there we go. So 64 to 82, and then we had a few years afterwards. And so there was...
We did.
So we're talking, we could still be 20-odd years on the Brezhnev example.
But during the Shah's...
hopefully we're talking about late Brezhnev.
During the Shah's time, people knew analytically that he was weak, but they couldn't imagine a post-Pahlavi Iran. Therefore, we have to now imagine a post-Ayatollah Iran, which would liberate 85 million Iranians, highly educated, urbanized, unleash them into the world economy, and it will become one of the most dynamic countries in the world. This is one of the themes of my book, that we have to think beyond the Ayatollahs when we deal with Iran. You're right, it could go on another 20-odd years, obviously. But, if you think about Gaza, Israel, southern Lebanon, northern Israel, the Red Sea, the shipping, the shipping nightmare in the Red Sea, it all has an Iranian address to a certain extent. And therefore, we're basically in a kind of grand conflict with Iran, Israel, the United States, the West. And the big change in the Middle East in the years to come may come from internally, from inside Iran. Remember, the Cold War did not end because of a geopolitical event. It happened internally because of the collapse of Soviet communism internally, which Gorbachev, unwittingly orchestrated, and that led to a change in the world.
And so what does that mean, though, geopolitically? Because obviously, when one way of looking at the Ayatollahs as a sort of late Brezhnev is, oh, yippee, the wall's coming down, democracy, etc. Another way is, oh, that was just an interlude, and it's no guarantee that what comes after will be a good situation.
You could have a Revolutionary Guard regime, which would be easier on the population in terms of religious oppression. The hijab would come off, all of that. But in terms of its allies around the Middle East, it would be just as hard line. That could happen. You could have a period of semi-anarchy or semi-chaos. that could last a few years, because you have these outlying regions like Baluchistan in the southwest, Kurdistan in the northeast. Yes, Iran is eternal. It's existed since antiquity as a great power, but it has also had periods of great weakness on the Iranian plateau and others. So that, you know, a lot of scenarios are possible, but but there's a question where it comes, what's worse than this regime? You know, what's worse? Well, you could get something worse, but you could also get something much better.
Putin is worse than late Brezhnev, I would say.
Absolutely.
So, but there is an optimistic scenario there. So that's now. But and now I want to bring you to Israel-Palestine, and I think for how we're dealing with Israel-Palestine at the moment, we're dealing with Iran as it is. And I've got sort of two questions. One is about what could bring peace, and the other is what could bring more war. And I think I'm going to start with the peace.
Okay.
And what would it actually take to get a sustainable peace in Israel and Palestine? And do you think, I mean, we've seen we're in the middle of this terrible war, but we've seen arguably an important shift by the Biden administration in the last week or so. I don't know how you rate that, if you think that's a sort of minor shift or a big shift. But how do you see the possibilities of peace?
Well, first of all, in a de facto sense, Gaza has been independent since 2005 because the Israelis just withdrew not only all their troops, but all of their settlements, too.
Yeah, but they have no airports, they have no sea access, etc.
But so there was an element there. Again, imagine what Lee Kuan Yew could have done to Gaza in 2005. He would have built great ports rather than underground tunnels, so to speak. So the Israeli experience with Gaza has moved Israel to the right, dramatically to the right, even though Netanyahu is very unpopular. There's a bit of a contradiction there, you know? But the population has moved to the right because they see if they were to give up the West Bank, which they can't because it's filled with ink blots of Jewish settlements, but if they could, you know, have some sort of an arrangement, they would say that, well, Islamic Jihad will come to power in 2 or 3 years there because of the weakness of the Palestinian Authority. So, and after what we've experienced in Gaza, we're not going to allow that to happen. So that Israel has moved to the right, because the October 7th, because of the ferocity of the attacks, may have changed the Israeli calculus on dealing with Iran. You know, to become more assertive, more using the military, all of that. And then just finally, 60,000 Israeli citizens cannot go back to their homes in northern Israel. That's a de facto loss of sovereignty, which no government can sustain for a long period of time. And so therefore, what I'm afraid to say is the more likely scenario rather than peace is that we're going to see more fighting in Gaza, a war in southern Lebanon, unless Israel can restore deterrence in southern Lebanon. And I don't know how you do that without going to war or dealing with Iran or something like that. So I think the near-term scenario is quite bleak because, as I said, Netanyahu might go, but the shift to the right in Israel seems profound.
Okay, but can I just push you a little bit? What about the shift in the Biden approach? And of course, we don't know how long Biden's going to be there. But let's look at a scenario where Biden actually wins in November. So obviously, if Trump's there, it's, I think, different scenario. And I can't see how he would put any pressure on Netanyahu. But what about so imagine that scenario, the continuing Biden scenario, and what sort of pressure can America realistically put on Netanyahu or on his successor to come to terms with the Palestinians?
I think it's happening as we speak, Hugo.
Right,
Because,
but what's the impact?
And here's why. I think had it not been for American pressure, Israel would have invaded southern Gaza and Rafah during Ramadan. I think that's been postponed, and that is a result of the White House pressure, because ultimately, as the late Moshe Dayan said, Israel's most important relationship is with the United States, and it has to keep that relationship healthy, or else Israel has very few possibilities.
But has it been just postponed, or has it been cancelled?
I don't know. I don't know. My sense is it's been postponed, not canceled, because if it's been canceled, Netanyahu risks his government collapsing because of pressure from his own right wing, who are demanding that Israel continue from north central to southern Gaza. Because after all, in southern Gaza is where the Hamas leaders are, it's where the hostages are. So if Israel were to stop now, from an Israeli perspective, they would say, well, what has this all been about? Kind of, you know.
But I suppose then the question about American pressure is, it's one thing if they've managed to get something postponed for the month of Ramadan, but if it just happens anyway, it may not change the dynamics dramatically. Is it possible for Biden to actually stop the invasion of Rafah, or to force Israel to do it in a much, much more targeted way than they would presumably have planned?
I think the latter. I think it's the latter. It'll be a different kind of an invasion of Rafah, what the White House had wanted originally all the time, which is something much more targeted, because there's various ways to skin a cat, and what Israel has chosen to do up until now has been a broad brush attack, and just blaming every casualty on Hamas for hiding behind its civilian population.
Okay, so but if that is indeed what happens, why is that inconsistent with then moving forward? Because the next stage, what we'll have Biden will say, well, now we need to get involved in a proper talks about a two-state solution. Is there nothing that he can do to force that? If he has another term?
There's one other element of this which proves your point, which is the Egyptian and Saudi regimes. They desperately need Israel to slow down dramatically on the civilian casualties, because they are getting intense pressure from their own populations on this. And so Biden, in a sense, is not only doing what he thinks is right, he's also running interference for NBS and for al-Sisi in Egypt, showing them that he can indeed put pressure on Israel and get results, so that those regimes are not under pressure the way they have been. What's been somewhat remarkable is, this whole thing is unfolded, and yet the Saudis have still not taken a future peace deal with Israel completely off the table. That's remarkable in a way.
So that would seem to suggest there's a little bit of maybe not a pathway to peace, but a pathway to something that, well, I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that you need peace. I don't think you can get this thing. You can't just have this thing sort of hobbling along for years. We have only 27 seconds,
right.
Robert. I would like you to say, just very briefly, if we come back here in 5 years' time, will we feel more optimistic or more pessimistic about the broader Middle East?
I hope more optimistic. I hope there will be more
I hope so,
change.
but what will we actually do?
Because as I said, progress does not happen according to a Western script. It's indirect. And I think we will see, there are vast technological and cultural changes going on throughout the region among young people, which is going to shift things.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for such a brilliant audience.